Good afternoon and welcome to the 716th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club. The Economic Club of New York is recognized as the nation's leading nonpartisan forum for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. And we've had over 1,000 prominent guest speakers appear before the club over the last century. And so therefore, we have a strong tradition of excellence, which continues up to today's conversation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to students from CUNY Graduate Center, Fordham University, and Mercy College joining us today virtually, as well as members of our largest ever class of 2023 fellows, a select group of diverse rising next-gen business thought leaders. Today, I'm honored to welcome back our special guest, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. Bob served in President Trump's cabinet as the U.S. trade rep from 2017 to 2021 and was a deputy U.S. trade rep under President Reagan. He's one of America's most respected experts on international trade, having negotiated literally dozens of international agreements and practiced trade law for more than 40 years. Today, he joins us to discuss his new book, No Trade is Free: Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping America's Workers, a book that challenges the way we think about trade policy in this country. The format will be a conversation, and we're delighted to have club member Fred Hochberg, president of HeyDey and former chair and president of US Exim Bank, doing the honors of moderating. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record, and we do have media on the line today. With time permitting, they will take questions from the chat box. And Fred, if you're ready, we're going to turn the mic over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for the Economic Club. And that was part of my introduction. Yes, we're on the record. We're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience to submit questions. One thing I will say, this book does remind me, Bob, when I went to business school and we had a book to read, and the professor said, remember, this doesn't read like a novel. This does not read like a novel. It's an excellent book, and it's very well researched and very thoughtful, and we have a lot of students on. But it's a very thoughtful book about trade and how you believe we should reset the trade agenda. And so we're going to talk about the book, but really go beyond that. And I wanted to just underscore, Bob and I do come from different political parties, but I do want to credit Bob and President Trump with three things in particular. One, putting a focus on China, our relationship with China, and trade with China. I think some of that changed, obviously, with Xi Jinping, who I think ratcheted up, but a lot of that was there, and I think your work and this book puts a greater focus on that. Two, unrelated to the book, we now see at the recent NATO conference that more NATO nations are going up to 2% of their defense spending of GDP, and also an important achievement. And of course, USMCA, which took a different path on trade agreements, particularly in areas of dispute resolution and labor protections. So one quick question just on that record. On some of the things in USMCA, there were a lot of things that uniquely made that work. Do you think some of that can be replicated in the future?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure. I want to thank Barbara for a kind introduction, and you, Fred, for putting the time in to come and see me, and to putting up with me, and to congratulate you on your government career, not just government career, but your career overall, but your government career at Exim Bank. I'm a firm believer that the Exim Bank is a very important part of government, and if we're going to compete, we have to have it. So, and it has its own controversy, some of which is sort of, I don't quite understand. But, to move on to your question, we started off in the way I see things. NAFTA was a bad agreement. All right, it was a very bad agreement. It was a result of politics and a kind of a hubris, which infected the 1990s. And
even though it started with President Reagan.
So if you want to talk about the U.S.-Canada agreement, So the U.S.-Canada agreement I would put in a different category than NAFTA. And indeed, the Canadians didn't even want Mexico in it, really, for a long time. But adding an economy like Mexico's is very different than having a free trade agreement with Canada, I would submit. So it was, to me, it was a mistake. It was one of 3 great mistakes made in the 90s that affected working people and negatively affected our country. Now, the question is, can we enlarge it beyond that? I presume you mean, could you put the benefits of it in other FTAs? I'm not, in some cases you could, in some cases you couldn't. To me, North America is a special case. I think that while a lot of these FTAs are misguided or neutral, that having a North American market is positive, and that the United States benefits from prosperity in Mexico, obviously Canada, but Canada, as I say, is different, benefits from prosperity in Mexico in a way it doesn't in other places, generally, Peru or Chile or whatever. We have a genuine stake in prosperity, and I've said this before publicly, including in Mexico. So myself, I would not enlarge FTAs. I think that the model is a bad model. I think it doesn't make any sense. The basic notion is sort of trading your prosperity and your own jobs for friendship, which never struck me as being fundamentally very consistent with human nature. So you could certainly do some of the things, and if I were in and wanted to keep these FTAs, I would recommend doing the digital stuff. I would recommend getting rid of ISDS, as you suggested. I would recommend changing the rules of origin. There was a lot of very, very profound things that we did, and took a lot of heat from, by the way. Some from Democrats, but a lot more from Republicans, and some newspapers for their own benefit. I was living in their head of their editorial board, rent-free for some period of time. But so I think what we did was important. I think USMCA is different than the other agreements, and as a general matter, I'm not a fan of FTAs. Okay.
So what I thought we would do is talk about China, which is a centerpiece of your book, and then talk a little bit about, if we have time, about the Biden administration, where we're going from here, and we'll see how much time we have and where our audience comes in.
Great.
So one of the things you mentioned in the book, that you thought that China was the biggest threat to America since the Revolutionary War. That eliminates the Civil War, that eliminates World War II. So tell us about that focus, because that's a strong statement about the threat we threat.
It's meant to be. If you were going to make any modification to it, you would say the War of 1812, right, maybe, because there we were fighting a nation that had a bigger economy than ours at that time. So I say that because, one, they are clearly hostile, and they're hostile not only to the United States because we're number one and they want to be number one, but because they find our system of democratic freedom to be a bad system.
Right.
So the Chinese themselves tend to be xenophobic anyway, right? They tend to be very, very focused on themselves.
They built a wall.
Yeah. Although, yeah, exactly. But that wasn't to keep people in.
No.
But I take your point. So the Chinese are, by their own words, they're very hostile to us. And the reference really there is not only to the hostility, because we've had hostile adversaries, but also to the size of the threat. So they have a population that's multiples of ours. They have a GDP that is much closer to ours, for example, than the combination of Germany and Japan together in the Second World War. So we've never really faced an adversary that was as close to us in economic strength, much bigger in population, approaching, if not the same as us, in technology, and really devoted to a global scheme of hurting the United States, of becoming number one. And that's what their military does. They intimidate us. That's what they steal our technology. They woo our businesses. They try to influence our academics and our students. Their diplomacy, the so-called wolf warriors, go around the world very hostile to the United States. So they are clearly a hostile force, and that was more a reference to size. Really, since the revolution, the only time we fought anyone who was remotely our size was what somebody called the Second Revolution, or the War of 1812.
It's funny, I use the same analogy in my book. I would say 1812, that war was the closest to what we have right now with China.
And I think that's, but even in that, was the threat as great as it is now? So I would say, even in the War of 1812, the economies were the same. But remember, for part of that, the UK is fighting France.
Right.
I mean, we see all these things in our own way, and you say, well, what happened? Why did they come and finally, after a stalemate in that war, end up coming and burning Washington? Well, they got rid of Napoleon. So so that was a difficult time for sure. But even that wasn't a threat. And this was not a threat to the way we think and our system of government and our businesses and our population. That was the question. There was never going to be whether what we think of as the basic American way was never at risk there.
So people talk a lot right now about decoupling or de-risking, and they're different. De-risking says we have to diversify supply chains. We can't be so reliant. Decoupling says we need to get away from them. So tell us how you see those two issues and where you come down on that.
Well, for me, I am an advocate of what I call strategic decoupling. And in the first place, I don't know, when I hear things like we want a small yard, high wall, we want de-risking. I never know quite what that means. Does that mean that in order to build our F-35, we want to have a source of chips overseas, but other than China? I mean, that if that's de-risking, it's a pretty small de-risk, right? So de-risking tends to me to be kind of a cop-out, right? You either acknowledge the level of the problem and then you act, or you say, there are forces around here, I don't either understand how serious the problem is, which is the case for some people. They just don't believe it. And those people I worry about. Or they say, well, we can put up in this existential competition with a certain amount of risk. And that strikes me as dangerous thinking. So the way I calculate it is I'm not for no trade. I'm not for no economic connection, for sure. But I think about strategic decoupling as follows. One, you put in place tariffs to get to balanced trade. So when you think about this, a lot of people think about our competition with China. They think in terms of the military. They think in terms of technology. But what they miss is that we're also transferring to them hundreds of billions of dollars in net worth in our wealth. So let me add that up a little bit. So we're running a trade deficit. We can talk about the meaning of trade deficits later if you like, but we're running a trade deficit which basically transfer, you can do different numbers, but say the 350 or so billion dollars a year. That's wealth that the United States has that we're giving to them because of the imbalance in
But we
trade.
get something in return.
Well, yes, and we'll talk about that because it's good to talk about that. But the question is building their army worth cheap T-shirts. But we can focus on that. Let me try to say what the wealth transfer is, because it's important to do what you're saying. It's important to talk about trade deficits as they are. But let me just make this point. So we are transferring wealth to them, largely for consumables, but for other reasons. There's probably another $150 billion of wealth that we're transferring to them that that happens because we don't keep track of. There's a loophole in the way we keep our statistics, is so-called de minimis, which I won't go into unless someone is interested. And then in addition, we're transferring, by our estimates, say $300 billion in technology that they steal from us. In addition, we are transferring some additional wealth to them through other countries like Vietnam, where they're transshipping. And then in addition to that, there is some amount of billions of dollars that is transferred to China because of the precursors to fentanyl that they sell to Mexico that come to the United States. So when you add it all up, no one knows what the number is, but the number is certainly $500, $600, $700 billion. So if you do that every year to someone who you acknowledge is an existential threat and an opponent, and someone who I would suggest is hostile, that strikes me as just a completely stupid policy. If you look at what they spend on their Army and Navy, it's less than we ship to them. If you look at what they spend on their technology, it's less than what we ship to them. If you look at what their economic growth is, and say they have a $17 trillion economy and they're going to grow at 5%, that's about what we're shipping to them. And to ship that after you've made the initial assessment of the threat strikes me as a very bad policy. And a de-risker saying, well, we're going to do a lot of that. We're going to ship most all that money anyway, even though we've made the assessment about how bad they are, it strikes me as a very, very weak policy. So I'm for strategic decoupling. And I ask, that's balanced trade. It's disentangling technology, which we could do over a period of time, both of these over a period of time. And then I would put restrictions on outgoing investment, because all the investment that comes from the United States and goes to China is net in China's favor. Because if it wasn't, they wouldn't let it in, right? I mean, it's not like this is a market. And their technology coming here, I would severely restrict. I mean, investments coming here, I would severely restrict, because that also is net in their favor, or they wouldn't do it. So I think if you did those things, you phased it over a period of time, you would get to a point where you had trade, you would stop shipping money and wealth to an opponent, and in the long run, combined with sensible things like building up our own economy, subsidizing chips, building our army, those things would put us in a position where we would prevail. And the greatest deterrent really will be the notion that we would in fact prevail. So that's where I am on that. The sort of de-risking it's like a half or a tenth measure. It's what somebody does if they're in a committee and can't quite come to agreement on things. And so they say, well, we don't want to annoy this group of billionaires who makes a lot of money importing, and we don't want to annoy that group of billionaires who makes a lot of money on technology. So we're going to, rather than have a plan to get us to even trade and technological independence, rather than that, we're going to kind of do half measures and compromise and try to get the whole committee on board. And typically that's not the best answer if, once again, this is all if you accept the threat is as serious as I think it is, and I believe, Fred, that you think it is.
Well, I'm not sure I think it is as serious a threat as you do. I mean, because what you're suggesting, if we get to balanced trade, that could take 10 or 20 years.
It wouldn't necessarily take 10 or 20 years. You could certainly do it in 5 years, but having a long-term policy to deal with an adversary is hardly criticism.
Right, I would agree. Help me understand because you have you and frankly President Trump had a keen, laser-like focus on trade deficits. We have budget deficits, and if you think the economy, the economy is built by government investments, corporate investments, consumer spending, exports. We have a budget deficit, and we have imports. So there are a lot of factors, but you seem to see the key thing is to eliminate the trade deficit.
Well, so I wouldn't say it's the key thing. So what do you want? You look at GDP. You want, it's investment. I want investment, and I think we need a policy. It's not my field necessarily, but we need a policy of low business taxes. I think sort of personal taxes are a moral question that people should ask themselves, but we need low business taxes so you can compete internationally and create jobs and get wages up. I think you need regulation at a sensible level, reduce unnecessary regulation, but there clearly are things we need to regulate. But if you look at GDP growth, GDP itself, it is the combination of basically investment, consumption, and net trade. So net trade last year was at negative $1 trillion. So you ask yourself, there is this notion that we're taught in school. And the first one, let me say, classical economists would have said what's happening is impossible, right? If you went to any of these classical economists and said, we're going to have a country that's going to run hundreds of billions of dollars in deficits every year for decades, they'd say, no, that can't happen, so don't worry about it. But of course it did happen. So when I talk about deficits, I say this. First of all, am I worried about a bilateral deficit with this country and a surplus with that country? No, not at all. That balances out. And you could have component questions with one or the other, but basically that balances out. If you said, am I worried about deficits this year and surpluses next year? No, not at all. I wouldn't. It doesn't worry me at all. What worries me is that we're running hundreds of billions of dollars in trade deficits every single year. That is what worries me. The system is not working. And by the way, certain countries are running surpluses every single year. And the market would say that shouldn't happen. It's the Chinese, but it's also the Mideast. But the Mideast, at least you can kind of explain that. But the Germans have would be another example. So what is happening is there's some dysfunction in the system, or this wouldn't happen. And maybe it's because we're the reserve currency, who knows? There's a lot of different explanations. But I did an article that was in The Economist, and I talk about it in this book, and it really drafted off of something that Warren Buffett wrote years before. And basically, when you analyze what our situation is, not the one where it goes back and forth, but ours, where you have decades of hundreds of billions of dollars of deficits, what you're really doing is you're transferring wealth overseas in return for consumption, right? That's basically what you're doing, and largely it's short-term consumption. So we have a number. What happens? We have a statistic that's called the net investment position of a country, and everybody has one of these. And the net investment position of a country is how much all your citizens owe overseas versus how much all overseas people owe here. And you can imagine, for most of our history, that number was a big positive number. And when Warren Buffett wrote his article in 2003, it was a negative something, 2 point something trillion dollars. That number is now a negative $17 trillion. So it is an enormous number, and that is equity, debt, and real property that we have transferred from our children and our grandchildren overseas in exchange for the third television set in the basement and the T-shirt and a variety of things like this. And it is not a sensible policy. Now, I'm not suggesting we should run surpluses, but if the things that we were taught in school were true, we would run surpluses sometimes and deficits at other times. And then the other thing that I would address is there is this notion that, well, the deficit is just the other side of the capital account. And that is true in the case of most countries, but it's not true when you run persistent deficits like this. And it's not true of the United States because we don't have a deficit in investment. We have lots of companies, and this is far more your field than mine, with lots of companies sitting on billions of dollars that they're not investing. We don't need that deficit. We're not like a developing country that would say, okay, fine, I'm going to run a deficit, I'm going to get inflows of investment, and that's going to develop me. We're not in that stage. So I think if you look at it sensibly, that we have to change that policy. We are getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And it's in some ways, it's even worse than the budget deficit, which I'm also against, because at least you can monetize the bloody budget deficit. When you're selling your assets to the Chinese Communist Party, you can't really monetize them. So it's something that really, really needs attention. And by the way, what I'm saying, while some economists say, oh, we don't agree with that, but a lot of them do agree with it. But business people, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, people like you who were business people, but in those days, 100% of them would have agreed with me. 100%, right? It wouldn't have been a single person that would have said this doesn't matter. Of course it matters.
You're right. I mean, because we're the world's reserve currency, it makes a huge difference. If you were a country, India, Prime Minister Modi was just here. You can't afford if you don't have.
It couldn't happen because your currency would adjust.
South Africa or any place like that, you cannot do it.
Exactly. So
we are in a unique position and do have a certain.
But countries also do things. So you say, why? So why? We talk about free trade versus fair trade. I like to talk about we really need balanced trade. So you say, why does China do it? Well, China has a whole lot of things that we know they do that are unfair, and some of which are just illegal, cyber attacks and theft and all of these.
They're not a good actor.
They have all these horrible things. But in addition to that, the very definition of having huge surpluses year after year means that they're doing other things too. So it's rather than playing kind of whack-a-mole and try to say, oh, you do this, you do that, they'll just find another way to do it. They have a banking system that takes consumption away from their own people and gives it to the producers to create a surplus. They have a labor system which takes consumption away from their own workers, gives it to the production sector. So you go right, it's right across the whole system. And none of the classic economists would have said, I mean, now obviously if you discovered gold, you would have a surplus for some period of time. But in a manufacturing, agriculture kind of an environment, none of them would say you could go 25 years and run up $6-7 trillion in deficit. That couldn't happen.
We are almost at the half hour, so I want to make sure that those who are not sitting in the room with Bob and me also have a chance to ask questions. So that screen is much too small. If there are questions on that screen, maybe someone at ECNY could read them aloud because.
Yeah, right now I don't see that we've got a fresh question in.
I'll keep talking. Bob and I will keep talking, and you just tell us when you've got some questions.
Okay, sounds great.
We'll take a pause. So, you and President Trump at times seem to be like Mr. Tariff Man. You like tariffs. And the reason I push back on that a little bit, because frankly, the inexpensive goods from China and a lot of Southeast Asia has actually helped keep inflation at bay for a long time. Do you see, it seems like tariffs and deficits seem preeminent, and I think about how does that fit with, Bob, with issues around the climate, currency, healthcare, all those other issues with China, because it seems to be more single focused. Or am I missing the point?
Well, let me get to other things with China, cooperating with China in a second. So if you buy the idea that you have to have balanced trade, let's say globally, first of all, because you're not going to get balanced trade in the long run by just tariffing China, right? But you'll help yourself a lot in the short run, but other people will eventually. So, but there's sort of three ways you can get balanced trade generally. One was recommended by Mr. Buffett in his article, and that would be, say, in order to import, you need an export certificate. And you'd phase that in, and if you were going to bring in a sweater, you'd buy an export certificate, and you would get a balanced trade. Another is you could put a fee on investment, a capital access fee, so that if you had $1 worth of surplus, you could only get 70 cents or whatever the number is, to figure out. And then the third is tariffs. I'd be happy with all three of them. I picked tariffs because people understand them. We kind of know what they are. We have a long history of using them, and people have used them. The memory of man run not to the contrary. So that's why I say tariffs. And they're also kind of adjustable, right? You can kind of adjust them and get to where you want to get. So on this question, are there other things to do with China? For sure you want to do other things with China, but a lot of times you'll have a person who, when they say that, like let's work on the climate with China. Now let's cooperate with China. I would not cooperate at all in technology or anything. But to some extent, these are people who don't buy my first premise, which is that this is a hostile existential threat to the United States. If you do that, then you have to have a different approach. And I suspect, for example, that former Secretary of State John Kerry doesn't buy the idea that China is a hostile power. My guess is he is focused on his thing. He was never one who saw the problem of China. And if that's your view, then the most important thing is climate. Now, should we be trying to cooperate with them? Yes. Would I take thousands of American jobs and impoverish those people and break up their families in order to accomplish that? I just wouldn't even give it a moment's worth of thought. And I think that's what a lot of these suggestions are. They don't say it this way, of course, because it would be impolitic. But they're saying we want to give something to China, which basically translates into the prosperity of America, in order to get them to do something down the road. Now, the first question is, will they ever do it? And they have a long history of never doing it. But even if they would do it, is it worth taking our grandchildren's prospects and bargaining that? And my instinct would be no. China has as much interest in a clean environment as we do. They have a bigger one, really, right? And so it's all a question. Would I like them to clean up their environment? Yes. Would I pay with people's jobs and wages?
Well, I don't think anyone's suggesting that. I think one is trying to find common ground with an adversary. And if you find common ground, maybe you can find common ground in other areas as well. When I went to China as part of this strategic and economic dialogue in 2016, the only thing we could really agree upon was to deal with the climate and the environment. And I thought, why? Because everything else was much more difficult. But you sometimes start with
can you honestly say, Fred, that anything that came out of that dialogue on any subject, but specifically on climate, actually made the climate cleaner?
Not measurably.
So I just, I kind of rest my case.
Okay, do I have a question? Yeah, let's see.
Well, I might jump in here. I noticed one of the questions from members, if you all can hear me, for the ambassador was if he were U.S. trade rep today, or Gina Raimondo over at Commerce, what would be your highest priority?
So the biggest threat we face right now in the United States is China. We face a hostile China. Everything they do, and then you can go right down. They have the biggest army in the world. It's getting bigger. The biggest navy. They intimidate our aircraft. They intimidate our naval vessels. They're encroaching territorially on all the countries around them. They're building bases in Africa. They're trying to they're doing whatever they're doing in Cuba. They are a hostile power that openly talks about supplanting the United States as number one in the world. So what I would do, the first thing I would do, is I would put significant additional tariffs on Chinese products. I would get us down to balanced trade over a period of time, giving U.S. business, multinational business, a chance to adjust. I would begin the process of disentangling our technology. And I would do that by not, over a period of time, phasing in, not letting Chinese technology or come into the United States. I don't think you can have a technology company that doesn't sell here. So I would force people to make that choice. And then I would restrict investment going back and forth and I would allow investment that was in our interest, in the interest of the United States. But the fundamental question is, do you think you have this problem of China? And I absolutely think we do, and I think the vast majority of American people do. As Fred said, we raised the alarm. It's hard to even imagine how people thought 6 or 7 years ago. But we had a great assist by Xi Jinping.
Huge assist.
Right.
He really made that job a little easier.
He did it. He kind of exposed. So the way I look at it, they were always this way. They had a period when they thought it was more in their interest to hide their strength and bide their time. And now they believe that it is their time and they don't need to hide their strength. And so they're more openly hostile. So I'll tell you one thing I wouldn't do. I wouldn't be begging for meetings. I mean, that I'm not, I wouldn't be offering up, I wouldn't be ignoring spy balloons and cyber intrusion. I wouldn't be ignoring those things. I'd be complaining about them. But in terms of our actual...
I wouldn't say that we ignored them. I think there was a lot of outrage. I mean, it was pretty audacious what they did. I mean, it was...
Well, we did let the thing go across the country for a week.
We didn't want to kill anybody when we shot it down.
That isn't even the rationale that they gave. There was plenty of places you could have shot it down. I think, well, who knows? But my own view is they didn't want to offend the Chinese. And now you see the president saying such things as, oh, that silly balloon thing, and that was just a misunderstanding. I don't believe that's true at all. I think when the Chinese go around the world talking to other countries who they're trying to persuade to be in their sphere, they point to these weaknesses. So for me, I would begin the process of strategically coupling. That would be my number one thing to kind of ask, to answer your question. And I honestly believe ultimately we're going to get to that stage because China is themselves doing strategic decoupling, right? I mean, they think of the elements that I just said. They have an import system set up that gives them a huge surplus. They don't run a deficit. They have a system of technology which wants not to be integrated with ours and wants to be independent of ours. And they control investments going back both ways. So I think eventually we're going to get to this stage. And my hope is that in the next election, there's a lot of focus on this Chinese problem.
Well, China, I think, even the China 2025, that approach, they really would just as soon not trade. They don't want to buy anything from the rest of the world if they could make it all themselves.
I think that's exactly right. They want to sell, get rich, use the money to build up their military, use the money to help their people, in fairness, and become the dominant party and to prove that totalitarian communism is the approach of the future. That's literally what's at stake here. And
so the question came about what you think should be going forward. It sounds like, would you be in agreement with Catherine Tai and how she's taking USTR?
So I hesitate to say I like Catherine because then everyone will decide that a Trump guy likes her. But I think she's smart. I like her. I think she's doing a good job. Yes, I like Catherine Tai.
And so,
and she knows this issue and she understands this fundamental threat.
And should we therefore be doing more friendshoring and reshoring? Are you sort of in that place?
So look at it. What we should be doing is strategically decoupling.
But all right.
But let me just say, Fred, by its very nature, if you're doing that, then things are going to shift to other sources. So that will be what will happen. Now, if you're saying, well, in the meantime, we're going to try to do it halfway, okay, halfway is better than no way at all. But should we be buying our technology from Europe instead of China? Absolutely. But we really should be making it here. Should we be buying our consumer goods in Mexico instead of China? 100%. But we need to do more manufacturing here also.
So things just like solar panels, we've basically lost most of that industry. Should we be importing that to the United States from China or not doing that?
So in the first place, we put tariffs on that, and the Biden administration gave them a loophole, basically, to let them continue to ship it in. I don't know why they did that. It's either because the environmental groups thought so much, or the countries that were getting the benefit of it thought so, or because they thought it would be offensive to China. But to me, I think solar is important. It's essentially the technology we essentially invented ourselves, and we got run out of the business entirely because of unfair practices by communist China. So we should be transitioning for sure away from bringing in those products from there.
So also in terms of being more independent, should we be also more EV, more electric vehicles and so forth, because that would mean less fossil fuel and we would be a little more independent from the rest of the world? I'm just trying to...
Well, sure. No, I mean, I think, so there's a couple of questions there. One, how independent should we be? We should be as independent as we possibly can be, in my judgment. Two, there's a kind of an element of should we be, and maybe you didn't mean this, but I'm reading it into it, should we be doing things to sort of subsidize certain technologies? I believe we should, right? I mean, I think you should start with the proposition that subsidies are bad and a mistake,
Right.
but realize you have to do them occasionally, and in the right case, you should do them. And on the EV thing, let me just make a point that doesn't get proper attention. You ask yourself, we've talked about what the Chinese do and their whole industrial policy. They have an American company come over. The American company thinks he's real smart, he's making money, and he makes money while they think he can.
Right.
They have a joint venture, they take over the technology, they create a competition, that competition takes over the world. They've done this across the board, and we've let them do it because we have no government policy against it, and we've lost all those jobs and all that wealth, but also because a lot of business people are short-term oriented, and they're, listen, I'm making money, or they're sort of arrogant and think I'm going to be the one who doesn't. But now that process has shifted. We've seen it in solar, which you mentioned. We've seen it in steel. We've seen it in textiles. We go right down the line. Now we've seen it happen actually in automobiles, which are more important, right? Automobiles are a huge part of the industrial complex of the world and a huge part of trade. And now they're the biggest manufacturers of automobiles. They're the biggest exporters of automobiles, and that's just going to take off. And they're flooding, for example, they're flooding Europe. And you ask yourself, why are they not flooding here? It's entirely because we put tariffs on them. We put 25% tariffs on them. And that's why they're not coming here. And we're helping American jobs and American companies. So this EV thing, and I might just add one of the little known things is everybody talks about the EVs and thinks that the flood of Chinese cars going to Europe are EVs. Actually, 70% of them are gasoline cars. They're not EV cars at all. That's just more an example of their industrial policy. But that is a classic example of using tariffs in an appropriate way to help American workers and to help American technologies and American companies. And a lot of Americans are working now in that industry. A lot of technology is staying here. A lot of wages are going up precisely because we put 25% tariffs on Chinese cars 5 years ago.
So are you comfortable with a more protectionist view of our economy? Because that's really that will be the result of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know what, I hear all these terms and everybody has their own.
If we put a high tariff on certain things, it does help protect American jobs.
Well, no, for sure. Absolutely, for sure. No, I'm in favor of using tariffs to get the balance rate. I'm for sure in favor of using tariffs to get the balance trade with China. Yes. And I'm in favor of using tariffs to help technology, to help keep technology in the United States, as well as subsidies. And you say, there's always this question, well, is it inflationary? And economists in a laboratory would have said, oh, it was. But then we put $370 billion worth of tariffs on, and there was no inflation. So you say, well, are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? And then even some of the people who are hardcore kind of free trade types would say, well, maybe it was 0.25%. So, and even if there is any impact at all, I mean, mostly it's absorbed by the Chinese or whoever, but if there's any impact, it's short term because eventually you supplant, you either build here or you build there. But if there's any even short term effect, to me, the result of more jobs, more technology, higher wages in the United States is far more important than those things, because the families And the communities in America that have been so devastated by this bad trade policy are what makes America great, right? It's this combination of all these families staying together, people having pride in work, right? And creating great small communities, and then those becoming big communities, those becoming the country. So I think that the inflation cost is very, very small, if it exists at all, and it's short term, but for sure it is worth it if the payoff is the United States stays the greatest country in the world and has the workers and living in a happy community.
So I'm going to have to jump in here.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the clock has hit the magic hour.
I'm sorry. I thought it was an hour. My mistake, Barbara.
Yeah. Sorry, no worries. It was a superb conversation, and I appreciated the way Fred used a number of the questions that had been submitted by members in advance when he was doing his questioning as well. So thank you both for that. I just want to mention real quickly as we close, coming up tomorrow, we have a member peer exchange event focused on advances in AI technology and regulation and the impact of that on society. Will be hosted by club member Nick Adams over at Differential Ventures. And then on Monday, we have a signature luncheon event featuring Lena Khan, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And then we have a virtual event with Jesse Von Toll, also next week on the 27th, who is the CEO of the Community Reinvestment Coalition. And of course, you can see there an early peek into the fall agenda. We'll have a 9/11 event where we'll honor a couple Medal of Honor winners. We will have a event September 14 featuring the CEO of UBS. We're very excited about that. And then just a couple days later, Ken Smetters over at the Wharton School will be talking about their budget model. And then Brian Moynihan will join us on the 27th of September, the CEO of the Bank of America. And please be sure you continue to check the club's website and emails as we share updates and announce our fall calendar. And as always, we like to recognize those of our 362 members of the Centennial Society joining us today, because their contributions continue to provide the financial backbone of support for the club and its programming. So again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Fred, for a terrific conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again, hopefully next week. So thanks all. Have a good rest of the day.